Jeffrey, when we left off last time talking about calling, I said I wanted to talk to you about that convergence between sovereignty and calling, and I'm going to do something a little funny here. You and I have a friend in this ministry. His name is Roger, and he's here in the room with us because Roger's our guy behind the camera. And Roger and I were having dinner last night, and he told me a little bit of his story. And, you know, Roger was one of these people who had a calling. He had a profession that he really loved and stuck with for a long time and became very good at it. I mean, he really said, this is my lane, I'm running in it. And yet, as we kind of revisited his life, he told me that the difference between him being in that profession and not being in it was literally seconds. He was about to walk out of his apartment to go to another job when the phone rang and a buddy said, hey, why don't you come over here and try this out with me today? And that became his profession, this place in his life where he did. Tell me about that sovereignty and calling. Those things get blended and actually are part of our call, aren't they?
Again, it gets back, Jeff, to the issue of sovereignty. And if God controls everything, some people are offended by that. They're offended by the idea that if God controls everything, then he's an evil God because he allows evil. I love what John Piper says, that at some point we have to create a category in our mind where God can ordain sin and yet himself remain sinless to accomplish ultimately in a fallen world his purposes, which is a wild thing to think about, but it's a category that's not congruent with what we think of sometimes as justice. Sovereignty. How does sovereignty play a role? Is it to play a role? Well, I think all of us would admit that when we think we're in control, if God's not sovereign, then why am I worshiping him? If there is no sovereignty, if he didn't control that phone call at that moment in Roger's life, if he didn't, for me, I have some very close European friends, and we make the joke often about how we met, and it's changed my wife and mine's life. We lived in their home for years. I still travel to Europe 2 or 3 times a year. That relationship has had broad and long-reaching impact into our lives. And how did it start? I met a guy who met a guy. This guy, they went to Las Vegas, hated it, called his friend back in Munich and said, hey, we're leaving, we can't stand this place. He goes, oh, why don't you go to La Quinta? And there's a guy there named Jeff Cranford, and ultimately it was bad weather there too. And so we make the joke of this 20-year running relationship was a function of because it rained in Las Vegas. Now, let's think about sovereignty. Let's think about God. Well, there's plenty of verses that talk about God controlling the weather. Even this recent Hurricane Sandy, controlling the weather. Jesus calmed the seas, in part because he was claiming to be divine and saying, I have control over everything. I have control over the wind and the seas, and that's what his disciples' response. He has control even over the wind and the seas. If he's capable of doing that, what he's looking at in the future is bringing about his purposes in the earth. Isaiah 46 talks about this. It talks about him looking into the future and calling out. He's not a cosmic fortune teller. What he's doing is he's looking, and because he has all power, all authority, and every ability to control down to the smallest of the small, quantum level, up and down quarks and how they move, the reason he's able to tell us what's going to happen in the future in his sovereignty is because he's able to control everything on the planet and in the cosmos. He doesn't have to speculate in his fortune ball about what chaotically is going to come about, and he can prognosticate. He tells you what the future is going to be because he controls the future. Now, how does that relate to sovereignty and calling? Because he knows me before I'm even in my mother's womb, he calls me and predetermines that this is my reason for being on the earth and my calling. It's not because he's looking into the future and just speculating or seeing in his crystal ball. He's able to bring it about. He brought it about with Roger. He brought about that call even before Roger was aware. He brought it about for the Apostle Paul, and many of the things that he needed in his Roman citizenship, as we alluded to earlier, and his study of the Word and his influences and his context. He brought all that about even before Saul, who would become the Apostle Paul, even knew him.
Right.
He's working behind the scenes in your life, whether you believe in calling or not, ultimately to bring about His purposes in the future, because He's qualified to do that because He controls everything.
Yeah.
So sovereignty and calling are interrelated. Calling starts way before you hear that mystical voice. Calling starts even before He saw you in the yet unformed substance of the earth, which is crazy, but is also very exciting to think, well, I got 2 jobs, I don't know which I'm going to pick. And that's kind of the Gen X and Gen Y. They don't know what they're going to do, and they want to keep all their choices open. No, God knows. And just resting in that peace is somehow vitally, it brings me to a place of thriving, recognize that God controls the future, and He has a purpose for me in it. Whether He takes me tomorrow or leaves me for another 30 years, I worship a sovereign God. And as a result, I know I'll complete the race that He began for me. I know it.
Let me just for a minute defer to our free will friends. There are plenty of those who follow Christ who say, I think it's much more about free will than this sovereignty. And yet, I think they would agree that God recognizes a limitation about our free will, and that is that we wouldn't choose Him. That in our sin nature, when given these choices, we would much rather go our direction than His direction. And so then again, it gets back to calling. That God's going to take us to places through His sovereignty, however down to the detail that is, and grab our attention and say, you know what? Let me show you why my choice is better.
Correct.
And again, it goes back to God orchestrating the things that get our attention and move us in the direction that He ultimately has for us.
Well, let's pick up a little bit on that in the next segment, because I'd like to talk to you about something that we scientists there's a tension there between God's sovereignty and our choice in terms of calling. And I just want to give you an example in the next segment about something that might help you understand that everybody lives in that tension.
Ah, beautiful. Thank you.